Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Draco Sinister. Now, I do actually have some story times for the beginning of this chapter, so if you don't want to hear me just kind of rattle on about love potions and love triangles and writing mishaps, skip to the timestamp right here. But for the rest of you, just come along with me on this journey. So, the first thing that we're actually going to discuss is this chapter is incredibly edited by yours truly. And the reason for that has a lot to do with just kind of the pitfalls that I see just in this particular novel as a whole, which desperately needed edited and will make sense as it goes on. But to talk about the original for a second, I really do think that Cassandra Clare painted herself into a writing corner with this MacGuffin, mainly the love potion, and I'm going to explain why. So, love potions, as they are in writing historically, we've seen it even in the Harry Potter series with regards to a lot of talk about what love potions are, why they are illegal, and why it's not good to to have a love potion that you basically cast on someone, and by cast I mean they have to imbibe it. Or, when we see Ron eat the chocolates that are made for Harry in The Half-Blood Prince as sent to him by Romilda Vane, we see that Ron becomes just euphoric and obsessive and all of these types of things about this one particular girl who has concocted and executed a perfect love potion. So that's the way it is canon in Harry Potter. Now, if we're looking at other things throughout other books, like the idea of Cupid's arrow being shot through the heart and how, that can have a long-lasting effect, or, if we look at Midsummer Night's Dream, which has a very particular flower, that the juice of which put into the eyes of someone who's sleeping in the first person that, upon waking, will see them and fall madly in love with them. That's a whole thing that we have seen. Now, I don't know if Cassandra Clare was actually lifting that from the Shakespeare text, but it reads very much like that. So that's the concept that I'm running with. Now, the problem is that in the original version of this chapter, there was this whole plot point where Hermione drinks the love potion, and then somehow she manages to keep herself awake by muttering a wakefulness charm under her breath. Now, Cassandra Clare had established that only Magids can do wandless magic, and Hermione is not a Magid. We know this. Second of all, we kind of already had it established at one point that, drinking this particular potion would make her fall into a deep sleep. So both things cannot be true at the same time. They just can't. The second half that really doesn't make any sense is the fact that when this particular love potion actually takes effect, Hermione falls in love with Draco. Sorry, spoiler alert, the first person that she sees, right? But the potion doesn't seem to really have an effect the way that it actually should. And what I mean by that is she is now permanently in love with Draco, but she can also feel her true love for Harry underneath this particular potion, which doesn't actually make a lot of sense if you think about the history of love potions in stories. And if you have any other examples of if that's not necessarily true, feel free to drop it in the comments. But myself personally, I just think it's really stupid. And I know why Cassandra Clare did this. She wanted to make this, really gut-wrenching love triangle between Hermione, Draco, and Harry. So, that you have this whole thing where, like, Hermione's under the effects of a love spell, and she doesn't want Draco to tell Harry that she's now madly in love with him because she wants to find, a reversal for it. So going around lying to Harry, the whole thing. But the whole time the potion's like, you must be with Draco, and it's just so much better if you kiss his face, the whole 9 yards. So that particular part of it was just sort of strange and odd. For one very specific reason is, I know for kind of the Dramoni stands out there, this would be like a very, yay, she's finally in love with Draco, and this is like a good thing. But the thing is that you almost have to change the characters themselves in order to make it work. Like, we kind of see that a little bit throughout this fic. Like, Harry has to be so far removed from his original incarnation that he looks paltry in compared with Draco, who is also far removed from his original incarnation, to make him look better by comparison. And that just doesn't work. I really do think that if you're going to have a fanfic where, Draco and Hermione get together, Draco has got to put in a lot more work than he is currently doing in order to make it a sound match. But also, I don't really go for the Dramoni ship anyway, and I'm sorry if that makes people angry, but that's just my personal take. So it's an unnecessary love triangle that kind of happens. So I have rewritten this section to make it make more sense. I'm actually leaning in to the whole love potion effects, rather than having this whole song and dance of, Hermione having, just really strange, I should say, symptoms of an incredibly ancient love potion. And yeah, that's about the size of it. So, I think that's kind of all that I have to say for now on this particular subject. So if anyone wants to read the original, let me know, and I will link something down in the description box or anything like that. But let me know if anyone wants to read the original chapter. I will figure out a way to link that. But as it is, I hope you enjoy my incredibly edited version of this chapter, and I really hope that it makes more sense in the long run of this novel. I feel like I'm kind of on a really weird trolley, kind of like in Indiana Jones when they're, bumping along and they almost get off the track. It's like kind of off the track, trying to get back on the track without losing the tenor of this entire fanfiction. So anyway, without further ado, let's just get into it. Chapter 5. The Undiscovered Country. As astonished as Draco was to see Hermione, he was even more astonished by the look on her face. It was a look he had never seen before. She looked enraptured, transported, and if it were possible, downright enthralled. "Hermione," he said, Are you all right?" She stared at him, her eyes somehow too huge in her face. Then suddenly she was in his arms, her mouth latching onto his with a fierceness that momentarily made him lose focus. The touch of her skin made any thoughts about Harry, his feelings, or the direness of their situation slip quietly away, and he found that he had pulled her against him. His heart felt as if it were trying to bang its way out of his ribcage, and he couldn't get enough air. But it didn't matter. Hermione was kissing him. And unlike those other times, this was something different, something new. Before, her feelings had never matched his. It had always been him kissing her. But now, it was her arm that hooked around his neck, drawing him down to kiss her. Her mouth soft against his and desperately seeking the inside of his own. She was saying his name over and over, a feverish and desperate whisper that made his head buzz. And then a sharp, unwelcome voice in the back of his mind spoke. "Something's wrong. You shouldn't be doing this. It's not right. Stop." He froze and pulled away from Hermione with a jerk, akin to an electrical shock. Panting, Hermione looked at him, brushing hair out of her dazed eyes. "Draco, is everything all right?" "No," he said. "We can't be doing this. Why are we doing this?" "You came here to rescue me, didn't you?" she asked, her eyes big with surprise and genuine confusion. Well, yes," he replied. "Then what's the problem?" she asked, still staring at him distractedly. Draco stared back at her. Sure, he had momentarily fantasized about the situation that had just transpired, but this was a little too good to be true. "The rescuing part isn't the problem, Hermione," he began slowly. "The problem is that you are Harry's girlfriend, and I don't think he would be too keen to know that when I got up here, the first thing I got was a hero's welcome." Hermione didn't respond to this, merely turned around and, for the first time, Draco saw the prone body of Wormtail lying on his back in the straw. Apparently, when Hermione had kicked him, it had been in the face. The straw around his head was dark with blood. "Merlin's beard, Hermione. What'd you do to Pettigrew?" he asked, staring over her shoulder. "I hit him," she said shortly. "I should say you did," agreed Draco, rather impressed. Then he shook his head, as if clearing it of cobwebs. "Never mind that. Was he the only one who was keeping you here?" Hermione shook her head. "No." "So there's someone else here? Someone more evil? More powerful?" Hermione nodded, and Draco could have sworn that he saw her eyes travel down to his mouth. "Right," said Draco and seized her arm. "We're going." He pulled her along, and she trailed him, perhaps closer than was probably necessary, but she kept glancing behind her every now and again, as if she expected them to be followed. "Do you know the way out?" he asked, panting as they descended. "No," she replied casually. "I don't think there is one, and he's around here somewhere. He's not going to just let us leave." "Who's he? Voldemort?" She laughed. "Voldemort? No." They reached the top of a wide staircase, carved of pitted stone that swept down to what had once been an entrance hall. Draco could see the dim outline of broken pillars and a cracked marble floor. He turned and looked at Hermione, who was still looking odd. "Can you make it down the stairs?" "Yes," she said in a lilting voice. He looked at her, bewildered, shook his head, and started down the steps. She followed him, closer than ever now. "Hermione," he said suddenly, turning towards her. "Look, it seems like we might have some time before we're well and truly out of here, so would you mind explaining what on earth is wrong with you?"
"Such a concern,"
said a voice behind them.
"How very endearing."
They both turned, Draco quickly, Hermione more slowly, finally showing a different emotion besides amiability. Salazar Slytherin stood at the foot of the stairs. Lupin looked up when he heard the knock on his door. "Just a second," he called out, glancing around hastily. He hadn't really had time to straighten up his office since he discovered it wrecked the day before. A few spells had fixed the windows and returned the nymph's snow globe to something resembling its former condition, although now the snow in the globe had a tendency to look rather blue. Reaching out, he yanked a copy of the Daily Prophet towards him, covering the pages of the book the centaur had given him in the Forbidden Forest, which he had no luck so far in trying to decipher. "Come in," he called. "Hello, Professor. You wanted to see me?" It was Fleur, smiling fetchingly, the light caught in her silver hair, turning it to tinsel. "Fleur?" he replied with wary caution. "Yes, I wanted to ask you something." Her smile broadened. "Yes?" "Do you know where Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy are?" Her smile vanished, to be replaced by a pout. "No, I do not. Why would I?" "Right." Lupin rubbed his eyes tiredly, feeling the beginnings of a headache coming on. "Look, I know that they sent you over here the other day to trick me into leaving my office, so it seemed possible to me that they might have let you in on the rest of their plans." "Maybe I came just because I like you," said Fleur, batting her eyelashes. Lupin sighed. "Fleur," he said, "I'm a werewolf. That Veela business doesn't work on me. Besides, I'm twice your age, and I'm your teacher." "I could take a different class," suggested Fleur. "I'd still be a teacher here at this school," said Lupin, now positive that he was getting a headache. "Well, actually, as to that," said a voice from the corner. Both Lupin and Fleur turned around. It was Sirius, of course, his head and shoulders visible in the fireplace. "I need to talk to you, Remus," he said. Relieved, Lupin turned to Fleur. "If you'll excuse us." Fleur gave Lupin an appraising look. Then she gave Sirius an appraising look, and it was clear that whatever she was thinking caused her to smile broadly, and she turned around, twitched her shoulders, and walked out, shutting the door behind her. "Pretty girl," said Sirius. "Quiet," said Lupin, in a tone that suggested that avenue of conversation was closed. "Are you back home, Sirius?" "I'm at the manor with Narcissa," said Sirius, who looked tired. "We got back last night. I've sent the auras packing for the moment, and have been up all night. I owled Dumbledore." "So did I. What did he say?" "He seems to think Harry's all right," said Sirius. "He's not worried, but, chancing that, I also sent a message to Ron Weasley last night. Since he's Harry's best friend, I thought he might have an idea where he's gone." "Good," said Lupin, trying to sound more optimistic than he felt. "Did you go to the Forbidden Forest?" "I did," said Lupin. He reached for the book and carried it over to the fire, where he showed it to Sirius and explained what the centaur had told him. Sirius looked at the book and shook his head. "Never seen anything like it," he said. "Not even during my aura training. Are you sure that's a language? Just looks like squiggles." "Oh, it's a language," said Lupin. "It's got recognizable patterns. I'll be damned if I've ever seen anything like it before. And considering that I only have half my books here, and half of those have been ruined—" "Speaking of books," interrupted Sirius, "I've just been talking to the Ministry about you." "About me?" said Lupin, thunderstruck. "I really like you to come and stay with us here at the manor." Lupin stared. "What does that have to do with the Ministry?" Sirius sighed. "The auras have been all over this place with a fine-tooth comb. They've taken Lucius's papers and all the dark arts items he collected. But they haven't touched the library. There are thousands of books in there. Many of them the only editions still in existence. It would take them months to sort and catalogue, and several of the auras have admitted that they've never seen half the languages represented here. So I thought of you." The Ministry is willing to pay you to assist in cataloging Lucius's library. I'm not an aura, Lupin protested. We don't need an aura, said Sirius. We need someone who specializes in dark art studies. An academic. Someone like you. I've got a job here, Sirius. I can't just leave. This job pays better, said Sirius, and Dumbledore's happy to let you go. He said he's already found a replacement willing to take over your class. Who? Said Lupin, looking curious. Snape, said Sirius, grinning more than ever. This time Lupin grinned back. I can just see Fleur trying to lure him out of the office. What? Nothing. So you'll come? Of course I'll come.
This is an interesting turn of affairs,
said Slytherin, in his harsh, inhuman voice. He stood very calmly at the foot of the stairs, looking tall and pale, wearing robes of a much richer green than he had earlier. They fell in thick folds to the hem, which was edged in gold. You, Draco said, staring at Slytherin. I know you, but you're dead. Slytherin gave him a cold smile. So, said Draco, who seemed to be warming to a theme, how'd that selling your soul thing work out for you in the end? Because I can tell you, from where I've been standing, it didn't look like a terribly bright move.
You know who I am, then?
Said Slytherin, not moving. You're my ancestor, said Draco, as he reached behind him to draw the sword out of its casing. And I think this is yours.
It is ours,
said Slytherin, looking at the blade, which Draco now held out in front of him.
If, as you say, I am your ancestor, you have my blood in you, which must mean you also have my dreams and memories. Soon, you will become me.
Draco shook his head. I really don't see that happening, he said, still holding the sword in front of him. Slytherin smiled again, even more coldly.
You're a child. You cannot recognize the workings of destiny,
he said, and glanced at Hermione.
I had thought she would love me, but that she should love you. That is even better.
Okay, there's one thing I didn't factor into this, said Draco, staring at Slytherin. You're a thundering lunatic. Hermione doesn't love me. Of course I do, Hermione replied, plucking at his sleeve and moving in so close Draco thought she might try to kiss him again. He was stunned into silence.
Consider it a gift,
said Slytherin, looking at Draco.
from me to you.
Hermione? Draco began, looking shocked. Slytherin paused, looking up at them with dark, empty eyes. Then he reached into his voluminous sleeve and withdrew an object that glittered darkly in the half-light. He held it tightly for a moment, looked at Draco. Then he said,
Here, boy, catch.
And threw it hard, directly at Draco's face. Automatically, Draco raised a hand that wasn't holding the sword and caught the object out of the air, then gasped as he felt a sudden jerk behind his navel. The world suddenly peeled down the center like an orange, and his vision flooded with a blur of color. He was aware of Hermione beside him, still clutching at his sleeve, and then the ground struck his feet, and he stumbled onto his knees, only just managing not to impale himself on the blade of the sword as he fell forward. Glancing around, he saw green grass growing up between cracked stone, saw a familiar tumble-down wall, saw the line of trees that marked the beginning of the forest, and over the wall, the tower from which they had just come. Slytherin had flung them outside the walls. Hermione stared around, dazed. She looked over at Draco, who had dropped the sword into the grass and was gazing around, looking furious. Damn it! He yelled suddenly. I can't believe I fell for that. Here, catch! That's the oldest trick in the book. Right up there with look out behind you. Staring down at the object that was clutched in his hand, he slowly opened his fingers and looked at what was there. It was a weathered piece of silver that looked like a sideways X, bent at an odd angle. A loop at the top showed where a chain could be threaded through it. "Looks like a piece of cheap jewelry," he muttered, more to himself than Hermione. "I can't believe he just let us go," she said suddenly. Draco looked up and frowned at her. "Hermione, he's madder than... well, I can't think of anything right now, but he's madder than some very, very mad thing. He's utterly bonkers, probably from having been dead so long." "He is mad," she said quietly, "but he's quite determined as well." Draco got up, brushing grass off his clothes, and reached out a hand to help her up as well. As she took it, Draco could see the longing in her eyes, and he dropped her hand as soon as she was on her feet once more. "I don't think we should touch again," he said, surprised to hear how nervous he sounded. "At least not until we're back with Harry and Weasley." "Ron's here too?" Hermione asked and bit her lip. "Of course he's here," Draco replied. "Harry is so stubborn he wouldn't let me leave without taking him with us." "But with both of them here, that will make all of this so much harder." Draco was bewildered. "Besides the fact that we just escaped a seemingly impenetrable fortress housing a man who's a few sandwiches short of a picnic, what will make this so much harder?" Hermione looked at him as if he were being deliberately obtuse. "I knew that I would have to explain to Harry why I have to break up with him, but to do it in front of Ron as well seems, I don't know, cruel, don't you think?" Draco stared at her, looking as if he thought he hadn't heard her correctly. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Now she just looked annoyed. "Well, obviously I have to break up with Harry." He shook his head. "I don't..." he began, then tried again. "Hermione, you're going to have to stop making a bit more sense because I love you," she said simply, her eyes taking on that dreamy quality she had since he had opened the door to her cell. "I'm in love with you." Draco felt the color drain from his face. He looked much as if she had hit him, then told him that she loved him. "No," he said slowly and with effort. "You're in love with Harry." "Not anymore?" She said this as if she were checking an item off a list that she no longer wanted or needed. She reached out towards him and lightly took hold of his arm. The material of his jacket felt as rough as sand beneath her fingertips. She looked up into his face, and her heart turned over. It was as if her longing was so intense that it had a shape and color of its own. "I don't want Harry to hate you." Draco closed his eyes. His mouth felt suddenly dry as the gravity of what was happening began to take on a terrible shape on the inside of his head. Hermione loved him, was in love with him. A part of him was elated and frantically began trying to justify the situation with rhetoric that made no sense. Perhaps the kidnapping had given her some time to think and discover that she really loved him after all? Or perhaps she was acting this way because she had been frightened, and seeing him had spurred her into affection without thinking? "No," said another voice, more sure than the first. "This has to be some kind of trick, some kind of dark magic. But I can't figure this out all by myself. I need to get her back to Harry." "You know this will hurt him," came Hermione's voice, breaking into his thoughts and sounding a million miles away. Draco opened his eyes. Then he reached out and put a hand under her chin, tilting it so that she was forced to look at him. "Do you really love me, Hermione?" "With all my heart," she replied, and the look in her eyes made his heart contract with pain. "Good. Then you'll be able to forgive me for what I'm about to do," he said, and raised his wand until it was level with her eyes. "Stupefy." As he rounded the side of the tower, Draco saw Harry and Ron standing in front of the wall, looking anxiously up at it, as if they expected him or Hermione to appear on top at any moment. Ron was saying something to Harry, and Harry was shaking his head. Not vehemently, but he could tell even from this distance that he was disagreeing firmly. He shifted Hermione's weight where he was carrying her over his shoulder. Then he called out, "Hey!" Ron turned first and saw him, and his blue eyes widened. And then Harry turned, and when he saw who he was carrying, he broke into a run until he was standing next to him. "Is she dead?" he asked frantically, and reached down to grasp her limp fingers. "No," Draco replied, and began walking over to where Ron was standing. "And where the bloody hell have you been?" demanded Ron, an edge to his voice. Then he noticed Hermione. "And what the hell did you do to her?" "Nothing to get your knickers in a twist about, Weasley," said Draco irritably. "I just had to stun her a little bit before we left." Ron narrowed his eyes, but Harry just looked confused. "Why?" he asked. Draco hesitated, then opened his mouth to respond when there was a soft pop, and Charlie Weasley apparated into the clearing. "Hello, Charlie," said Ron morosely. Draco was startled. "It hasn't been that long, has it?" "No," said Charlie, who was holding a letter that looked as if it had already been opened and read. "But this came for you, Ron." "Owlpost?" said Ron, reaching for it curiously. "It's from Sirius Black," said Charlie, looking faintly exasperated. "He was looking for you, Harry. I finally wrung some information out of Ginny and wrote him a long letter back. But I'd still rather you wrote him as well, Harry," Charlie said, then squinted at the figure slung over Draco's shoulder. "Is that Hermione?" said Harry flatly. Charlie stared in astonishment. "Is she all right?" "Yes," said Draco. "It's just a stunning spell. No reason to get all worked up. And before you ask me any more questions, I really think we should get back to camp. Hermione isn't exactly heavy, but it's hard to carry both her and this sword on my back at the same time." "Right," said Charlie, and reached into his pocket for the portkey. Later, back in Charlie's tent, Charlie sat utterly silent at the small kitchen table while Draco told him everything that had happened, minus the part about Hermione kissing him, as Harry was in earshot after all. Hermione had been put in one of the small rooms to rest until the stunning spell wore off. Ginny had been charged with watching her until she woke up, which seemed to make her feel better since she had been left behind. Meanwhile, Draco hoped that they would be able to sort out everything before she awoke and attempted something rash, like breaking up with Harry. "Salazar Slytherin," said Charlie, shaking his head in wonder. "Well, I suppose from now on you can say you defeated the most evil wizard in history." "I suppose I did," said Draco, looking rather cheerful. "If, that is, you mean defeated in the sense of having met. Although I made a lot of very cutting remarks. Pretty sure I wounded his feelings severely." "He let you go," said Ron, in a puzzled sort of voice. "Why on earth would he let you go? What was the point of kidnapping Hermione in the first place, if he's just planning to let her leave so easily?" "No idea," said Draco. "Maybe he didn't like the look of that sword," said Harry, jerking his chin towards Draco. "Remember what Lupin said? That sword can kill anything, even the risen dead." "Maybe Malfoy convinced him to let them go," said Ron quietly, looking at Draco with a meaningful glare. They all swung around and looked at him in astonishment. "You had plenty of time in there by yourself," said Ron in the same quiet voice. "Did you make some kind of deal with him?" "Deal?" said Draco blankly. "Well, you didn't come back and get us," said Ron, still looking at Draco. "You must have been doing something all that time." "Ron," said Harry, "if Malfoy didn't come back to get us, I'm sure he had a good reason." He looked squarely at Draco. "Didn't you?" "I couldn't," Draco said haltingly, thinking about what might have happened if Harry had been there when Hermione kissed him. "The Velas," he continued lamely. "Fine," said Harry without rancor. Then he turned to Ron. "Does it really matter if Hermione's all right?" In answer, Ron pushed his chair back from the table and made like he was going to stand up, but Charlie stopped him. "Ron, don't be a prat," he said. If Draco says he had reasons, then I'm sure they were sound ones. But on the subject of people being all right, what was this you said earlier, Draco, about Hermione acting strangely when you got to her? Draco paused, then looked over at Harry, who was looking back at him with an expression as equally interested as Charlie's. Ron just glared. He supposed that now was as good a time as any to explain. He took a deep breath. "All right," he began. "There's something you should know." But before he could go any farther, a small voice interrupted them. "Sorry to interject," said Ginny from the entrance to the kitchen, "but Harry, Hermione's awake, and she's asking for you." "Oh," said Harry, looking very excited at the prospect of seeing Hermione again, and began to move towards Ginny. Draco opened his mouth to stop him, then paused. She was asking for Harry. Not him. Harry. Perhaps this was a good thing? If she was awake and back to normal, then he needn't tell anyone about the special kind of strange that she had been acting. Charlie, however, seemed determined to stay on topic. "What were you about to say, Draco?" he pressed. "Meh, it was nothing," Draco replied. "I think it may have worked itself out." "Sounds more like you're back on your high horse again, and are too good to let us in on the details," said Ron nastily. "Got a problem, Weasley?" drawled Draco. "Yeah, I've got a problem," Ron replied, his whole frame leaking anger, "and I'm looking right at it." "Ron," Charlie warned, but Ron didn't appear to hear him. "Back in the forest," he said. "You should have come back for Harry and me, like he asked you to." Draco smiled. "It's none of your business what I do, Weasley." "Malfoy," Ginny attempted to intercede, but both boys were too busy glaring at each other to take much notice of anyone else. "It is my business!" Ron thundered and stood up so quickly the chair he had been sitting in was knocked to the floor. "These are my friends we're talking about, and maybe you can fool Hermione. She's got a massive blind spot where you're concerned. And you can fool Harry because he trusts everyone. And you can even fool Charlie with your stupid dragons. But you can't fool me, Malfoy. I know what you are." "Enough!" Charlie roared, and Draco and Ron looked as shocked as if they had both been hit with a Confundus charm. "I've just about had it with the two of you in your ridiculous teenage pissing contest. Ron, this isn't the time to air out your misgivings about how and why Draco went on without you and Harry. And Draco, if your goal here is to get Harry to trust you, then you might not have done such a bang-up job back there. But you can start now by telling us exactly what all this hedging about Hermione acting strange is all about." Feeling thoroughly chastised, neither Draco nor Ron spoke for several minutes. Although Ron was still looking mutinous, he stayed silent while Draco composed himself to say what he had been meaning to say. He never got the chance. For the third time that evening, Draco found himself interrupted, this time by Harry, who burst from the room down the hall where Hermione was and stormed back into the kitchen. He gave Draco a long, unpleasant look before shouldering his way past Ron and out of the tent. "What the—" Charlie began. Uh-oh. Draco had time to think before a flicker of movement caught his eye, and he turned to see Hermione standing in the kitchen. Her eyes, as they watched Harry go, were empty and devoid of any emotion. "Narcissa!" Sirius came skidding around the hallway corner to find Draco's mother, her hair in businesslike plaits, wearing a patched robe and a determined expression. When she caught sight of him, her eyes widened in surprise. "Sirius, what?" "This house is far too big," he complained, leaning forward on his hands and knees, struggling to catch his breath. "I think it crosses an international time zone. When it's 3 o'clock in the drawing room, it's 6 o'clock in the library." "Harry and Draco are all right," said Narcissa immediately. He straightened up. "How'd you guess?" "Because you wouldn't be cracking jokes otherwise. Did you hear from them?"
"From Charlie Weasley," he said, handing her a letter.
They're with him at that dragon camp he runs. Not all that far from here, actually. He says they're all perfectly fine and goes into quite a bit more detail. Read it." Some of the lines of strain vanished from her face as Narcissa read the letter. When she was done, she handed it back to him and smiled. "Well, goodbye," she said. Sirius blinked at her. "Goodbye?" he repeated. "What do you mean?" "Well, you're going to go rushing off to Harry, aren't you? To make sure he's all right. It's fine. You should go." "No," said Sirius. "I'm not." Narcissa blinked at him. "You're not?" "No," said Sirius. "Okay, I really, really want to, but I won't." "Why not? There's no harm in being protective." Sirius sighed and leaned back against the wall. "I know," he said, "and most of me wants to rush down there, drag him back here, and lock him in his room until he's 30. But the only effect that would have is that he'd get loads of practice using his Majid skills to break out. I have to show him I trust him, Narcissa." "Hasn't he just betrayed that trust?" she asked, curious. Sirius looked thoughtful. "Not really. He's being true to his nature. The impression I get is that his girlfriend was in trouble, and going to adults for help is just something he's never learned to do, and by this stage he's too old to learn it. He's just not any boy. He's Harry Potter. He's got adult-sized problems, and so far he's dealt with them on his own and dealt with them well. All I can really give him is support, and maybe a modicum of discipline. He's never going to have an ordinary life. There's no point in my treating him like he's an ordinary teenager." "It's not easy being godfather to a hero, is it?" said Narcissa sympathetically. "No," said Sirius. "I'd much rather he was some swatty little weed who never left the library." Narcissa laughed. "Sirius, you'd hate that." Sirius grinned. "Yeah, I would." He looked at her curiously. "I meant to ask before, what are you doing anyway?" "I was marking the objects I want to sell," she said calmly, and touched the tip of her wand to a painting of a dour-looking man with a pale face who was wearing a long black cloak. Immediately the frame began to glow a faint blue. "Take that, Uncle Vlad." "You're selling off the paintings? Why?" "I told you before," said Narcissa, moving down the hall and zapping another portrait. "The Malfoy estate is worth a great deal, but most of its worth is bound up in objects. Paintings, furniture, gold. I want to have some liquid capital for Draco to use." "When does he come into possession of all this?" asked Sirius, looking around. "Half when he's 17, the rest when he's 21. "Good Lord," said Sirius. "Do you think there's anything we can do to keep him from becoming a complete and utter pill?" Narcissa put her hands on her hips. "My son is not a pill." "Not yet," said Sirius, "but all that money and power—" "Doesn't even begin to make up for all the things he hasn't had," said Narcissa, her expression stormy. "You're feeling guilty," said Sirius. Narcissa looked at him for a moment, then sighed and ran the back of her hand across her forehead. "I am. It's all right. I feel just as guilty about all the things Harry hasn't had." "But you were in prison." "So were you." Narcissa sighed. "I suppose that's true." "They're both really exceptional boys," said Sirius slowly, "and if we can keep them from getting themselves killed, or from killing each other," put in Narcissa, "then they'll practically raise themselves." They looked at each other. Sirius was the first to smile, and Narcissa smiled back. "We're in big trouble, aren't we?" he said. "Yes," she agreed. "When are they coming home?" "Tomorrow morning, along with the Weasley boy, his sister, and Hermione, of course. That won't be a problem, will it?" "This house has 37 bedrooms," said Narcissa. "It's no problem at all." "What did you do?" Ron asked, dumbstruck. "It's very simple," Hermione said placidly. "I simply told Harry that we couldn't be together any longer. It wouldn't be right." "You... what?" Ron said, his mouth falling open in shock. "Now you sound like Harry," Hermione went on, as if this revelation was not earth-shattering. "I mean, I knew he would take the breakup hard, but honestly, storming out like that? It's really very childish of him and not at all sane." "Sane? Sane?" Ron tried again. "Hermione, you're the least sane person in the room right now. Why in the world would you break up with Harry? Is this still about Victor Crumb? Wait, is there any chance she's still under the Imperious curse?" "No," Draco said into the sudden silence, and at the sound of his voice, Hermione turned and her face melted into that strange, dreamlike quality he had seen in the tower. "Draco, there you are!" She all but squealed as she rushed to his side, and Draco had seconds to ward her off before she tried kissing him again in front of everyone. But she still managed to grab hold of his sleeve and pulled him close to her. "Hermione, what the hell are you doing?" Ron roared, but she ignored him. "You know, I should be angry at you for putting that stunning spell on me earlier," she giggled. "But I'm sure you had a very good reason, so I forgive you." Draco didn't know what to say to this, so he just stood very still while Hermione proceeded to fondle his jacket. "I must be dreaming," Ron said in a leaden sort of voice. "Or I'm dead. Yeah, that's it. Malfoy wasn't able to pull me back from the wall, and I've been Veela snack food all along, because there is no way this is actually happening." Ginny's expression, however, softened into a slight frown as she glanced past Ron to Hermione. "You know, if I didn't know any better, I'd say she was under a love spell." "A what?" Ron asked reflexively, still looking positively thunderstruck by this turn of events. "A love spell," Ginny repeated. "I was reading an article in Teen Witch Weekly that I found on a Charlie's sofa while I was waiting for her to revive, and it listed all the symptoms." At this, Hermione tossed her head and made a dismissive wave of her hand. "Don't be ridiculous, Ginny," she said to the other girl. "You know you can't rely on a magazine geared toward teenage girls. Besides," and here she snuggled closer to Draco, "love spells are a myth anyway." "Are they now?" said Ginny, and cast a furtive glance at Ron, who looked torn between hitting Draco and pulling Hermione forcibly off him. "Myth or not," he said, "I'm going after Harry." And he ducked out of the tent to find his best friend. "And while he's doing that, I think we should follow up on Ginny's hunch," said Charlie, who, up until now, had been silent and watching the drama play out with a look of shocked surprise. Ginny looked sharply at her brother. "You believe me?" she asked, startled beyond belief. "Well, I don't know if you're right about the love spell part, but it couldn't hurt to try and find out. Wait here, you three. I'll be right back." It was nearly sunset, and the sky above the camp was beginning to darken with faint lines, like the markings inside a seashell. Harry must have been walking so quickly away from the tent that it took Ron, whose long legs usually allowed him to move faster than anyone, several moments to catch up. If he had been worried about finding Harry, his worries were quickly dissipated as soon as he left the tent. It turned out to be a simple matter of following the sounds of breakage and explosions. He trudged nervously through the clearing until he got to the edge of the forest, in which he could now hear what sounded like tree branches breaking. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside the foliage and gaped at the bizarre sight that met his eyes. For one bewildered moment, he could see Harry, a slender, dark shadow in the middle of a mini tornado, and as he stepped farther into the trees, realized that leaves were whipping through the air with terrifying speed. "Harry," said Ron, caught between sympathy and amazement. "What are you doing?" "What does it look like?" said Harry, his voice sounding as if it were spoken through clenched teeth. "Harry," said Ron again, taking advantage of the momentary break in the storm to sidle a little closer to his friend, just in case he needed to tackle him. Although that option was looking extremely unappealing, due to the enormous amount of decent-sized tree branches that were strewn about the forest floor. "Did Hermione really break up with you?" he hedged. "Yes," said Harry, sounding irritated that Ron would even ask the question. "And not in any normal way either. She was incredibly specific about the details of her feelings, which is very Hermione if you think about it. She said that she no longer loved me, that she's in love with Malfoy and plans to spend the rest of her life with him. And I can either try to keep her with me, but she'd rather I just let her go and be with him, and how they're going to get married and have curly-haired blonde children, and it'll be all right because I can still be Uncle Harry. She said she'd even name her firstborn son after me, and crack! One of the larger trees to Harry's right split halfway down the middle. Ron gulped, then took a tiny step closer. "You know, hearing you say that makes me think that Ginny might be right." Harry whirled on him, his green eyes too large in his white face. "What are you going on about?" "After you left, Hermione came in and told us about, well, you know." In answer, Harry glared at Ron, who held up a defensive hand. "Okay," he said quickly. "Probably best if I don't say it out loud. But Jenny seems to think that she might be under the effects of some kind of love spell." "A what?" Harry asked. "Funny," Ron said. "That's just what I said. But it might be possible." Harry looked unconvinced. "Love spells are a myth, Ron. Snape all but told us so. Repeatedly." "Yeah, maybe," Ron agreed. "But if you had seen the way Hermione was acting around Malfoy after you left, I think you'd agree with me." "Then why didn't she tell me?" said Harry, at the trees and at everything else in the forest. "She could have just told me that instead of going on and on about their future life together." "I don't think that's how love spells work, mate," said Ron, glad to see that Harry might be coming round at last. Harry's eyes narrowed. Ron sighed and pointed at a log. "Look, sit down, Harry. I think you'd feel better if you stopped and thought for a second." To his great relief, Harry actually did sit down, and the leaves, which had previously been whirling about, finally settled. "So you really think there might be an explanation for the way she was acting?" he asked, staring glumly at the forest floor. "Well, to be honest, I didn't before. I thought I was going mad, or perhaps I'd been eaten by Velas after all and was having a very unpleasant afterlife." Now Harry did smile, a bit reluctantly, as if it hurt. "But hearing what you just told me, I think Ginny's the smartest out of all of us at the moment." "How did Malfoy react when she said that?" Harry asked, genuinely curious. "Well, he didn't deny that it could be a love spell, if that means anything," Ron said. "It does," Harry returned. "It means that he was just as confused as the rest of you." "How can you be so certain of that?" Harry turned to look at the other boy, but before he could answer, he stared with fixed alarm at a vague point across the small clearing where they now sat. Ron stared back at him quizzically. "What?" he started to say, but Harry clapped a hand over his mouth. "Shh," he whispered. "Look at that small bush over there." Ron looked and startled. The bush was rustling ever so slightly. He hadn't been able to hear it as they spoke, but now it was suddenly loud in the wake of their sudden silence. "There's something in there," Ron muttered around Harry's fingers. Harry nodded. "Or someone." "What do you think?" Ron asked as Harry removed his hand. The shrub gave another shudder. "One's out," hissed Harry, getting to his feet and fumbling in his robes. Ron followed him, taking his own wand out and holding it out in front of him. Moving as silently as they could, they edged across the clearing, Harry just slightly ahead of Ron, and paused in front of the shrub. He reached out a hand to grab whatever lay behind it, and something exploded out from behind the shrub with the force of a cannonball. It careened into Ron, knocking him to the ground. His wand went skittering out of his hand, and he yelled out loud in pain, throwing his arms up to protect his face from the attacker, which, Harry saw, had grayish, leathery skin, whirling red eyes, and long, spatulated fingers that it wrapped around Ron's throat. It was a demon. When Charlie returned to the kitchen, he found that Draco and Ginny had somehow managed to wrangle Hermione into a sitting position in one of the chairs. Ginny had decided that a free hands Hermione was more trouble than it was worth, as she kept trying to paw at Draco whenever he was in reach. In fact, Ginny had become so impatient with her that she cast Incocorus in order to keep her still. Now Hermione was glaring up at the other girl, and Ginny, who was looking at her wits' end by Hermione's actions, glared right back.
"There was really no reason to tie me up," she was saying now. "Between Harry storming off and you tying me up, you are all determined to make yourselves look like fools."
"What about Draco?" Ginny asked with barely restrained irritation. "He helped me wrangle you into that chair in the first place."
"That's different,"
Hermione sniffed, then gave Draco a long, long look.
"Draco can tie me up any time he wants to."
"Okay," interjected Charlie, cutting off Draco before he could reply with something he'd more than likely regret later. "I was able to find what I needed, so if you could all stand aside a moment. I need to talk to Hermione." Hermione looked at Charlie as he approached. Her eyes pleaded with him to see reason.
"Hello, Charlie,"
she said in a slightly tired voice. "Hello, Hermione," he returned.
"While it is ever so nice to see you, could you do me a favor and take these ropes off?" she cajoled. "Your sister is such a brute for having done this to me."
"I'm a what?" Ginny began and took a step forward, but Draco restrained her. Charlie held up a hand for silence and continued to speak to Hermione, almost as if she were a feral animal that might bite him if he got too close. "Hermione," he began again, "there's something I need you to do for me, and I promise it won't hurt."
"I'll do anything you ask me to, Charlie,"
Hermione replied, using almost the same tone he was.
"if you promise to take these ropes off."
"I can't make that promise just yet, but if you agree to drink this," and here he held up a very small vial that held a clear liquid, "I will gladly remove the ropes." Hermione squinted at the vial, then turned her head resolutely away.
"I'm not drinking that," she said, affronted. "Why in the world would you want me to drink Veritas serum?"
"Veritas..." Ginny started forward again, but Draco continued to hold her back. "Shh," he whispered. "If you don't drink it, Hermione," Charlie replied calmly, "then I don't know what else to say." "Let me try," came Draco's voice from the other side of the room. The others froze, and Charlie turned around to stare at him. "You're sure?" he asked. Draco nodded, although he didn't look happy about it. "All right," Charlie said, and stepped aside, passing the vial to Draco as he did so. As soon as he was close enough, Hermione leaned forward, as close as the ropes that bound her would possibly let her reach, and gazed at Draco with eyes that were almost completely dilated. How had he not noticed that before when they had left the tower? "Hermione," he began quietly, and held the vial in front of her eyes so that she could register it. "I really, really need you to drink this for me, okay? It's important."
"I can't,"
Hermione ground out, the pain of not being able to touch him etched into every line of her face. "Not even if I ask you to?" She shook her head violently.
"Not even then."
Draco closed his eyes. "Then I guess it can't be helped," he said, and turned around to face the others. Then, before any of them knew what he was about, Draco unstoppered the vial, emptied the potion through pursed lips, then turned
and kissed Hermione full on the mouth, the contents of the vial draining into her on a shocked breath. She had no choice but to swallow. "Ron!" yelled Harry, and tried to race over to his friend, but slipped on broken tree roots and branches and fell forward onto his hands. A sharp pain shot through his palms as they made contact with the forest floor. His wand skidded out of his grip, lost somewhere in the fallen leaves. "I don't need it anyway," he thought, getting swiftly to his feet. Without thinking, Harry lifted his right hand and pointed it at the demon. "Impedimenta!" he shouted. White light shot from his fingers and struck the demon in the chest, knocking it backwards. Ron immediately threw himself to the side and leapt to his feet, backing towards Harry. One hand was at his throat, which was ringed with livid red marks. Harry looked sideways at him. "You all right?" Ron nodded, sucking in gasps of air. Harry turned and stared at the demon, which was kneeling on the ground, glaring at them. He knew immediately that it wasn't the same demon that had broken into his and Draco's bedroom at school. How Harry knew that, he couldn't have said, but it was certainly one of the same breed.
"Harry Potter,"
it said, and its voice was like a crackling bonfire.
"soon you will die."
Ron looked indignant. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded in a croaky voice, massaging his throat. The demon's eyes rested on Harry.
"You know,"
it hissed. "Why is it that demons never had anything good to say? It's all, 'soon you will die,' and 'hell is coming,' and 'beware your doom.' Never just 'season's greetings from the underworld,'" said Harry in an unpleasantly calm voice. The demon stared at him. "No sense of humor," said Ron, shaking his head. All at once the demon lunged back at Ron, its hands outstretched. Ron ducked aside, and the demon landed on all fours, turned and faced them.
"Harry Potter!"
"Shut up!" yelled Harry, stepping between the creature and Ron. He felt a surge of rage that crystallized into a sharp, icy blade that twisted itself violently inside his chest. Pointing his hand at the demon, a bolt of white lightning shot from his fingers and struck it in the chest. The demon gave a startled, whining cry as it flew backward and slammed hard into a tree with an unpleasant squelching noise. Limply, it crumpled to the ground and lay there like a heap of rags. Still feeling the white lightning burning in his veins, Harry felt that he wanted to do something destructive, something violent. But suddenly he heard Ron speaking, as if from a long way away. "Harry! Harry!" He felt Ron's hands on his shoulders, shaking him, and he lowered his hand, suddenly unable to get enough air. "Harry!" Ron stared at his friend, who looked white and drained, his hair and clothes drenched in sweat, as if he'd just run a marathon. "Harry, are you okay?" Harry nodded without looking up and staggered backward, nearly crashing into a fallen log. "Breathe," Ron instructed him. "Just calm down, Harry." Harry obeyed, still trying to catch his breath. "That was really cool," said Ron after a pause, and despite himself, Harry looked at him and smiled. "Yeah?" he asked, still sounding choked and breathless. "Yeah," said Ron, and both boys glanced over towards the tree. Only a leathery gray arm was visible, protruding beneath the wreckage of Harry's earlier tirade. "Well, I think you killed it dead," said Ron. "Good on you, Harry." "I don't think so," said Harry. "His fingers are still moving." He straightened up, felt a wave of dizziness spreading over him, and announced, "I'm going to faint, I think." Ron jumped towards him and just managed to catch him as he fell. Hermione felt a soft implosion somewhere inside her chest and sucked in her breath. Something was happening to her. Something that a certain part of her wanted to fight desperately against, and yet another part of her didn't want to fight it at all.
She shut her eyes for a moment and only opened them again at the sound of someone calling her name. Draco's face swam into focus, and she felt a strange pounding in her heart. That was odd. "Hermione," he began, in a voice that sounded as if he were trying to keep some sort of emotion out of it. "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'm sorry if they seem out of place." She blinked at him. Why was he acting so strange? "Ask me," she heard herself reply, in a voice that sounded soft and dreamy. He hesitated a moment. "Do you love me?" She stared at him, bewildered. "No?" She saw his shoulders tense, but didn't understand why. "Okay then," he said, in a slightly constricted voice, and cleared his throat. "Are you in love with Harry?" Suddenly, Hermione felt her hands gripping the edge of her chair. "Yes." Draco stared at her, looking utterly stunned and also at a loss. "Why would you ask me such a silly question?" she replied. "Hermione?" came someone else's voice, and she turned her head ever so slightly and saw Ginny Weasley looking at her, hard. "Ginny," she said wonderingly, "do you know why Draco is asking me weird questions?" But the other girl wasn't looking like she wanted to make idle chit-chat, as she came over to stand next to Draco and look curiously into Hermione's face. "You went missing earlier, and we're trying to find out what happened to you while you were gone. When Victor took you, did he put some kind of love spell on you?" In answer, Hermione merely shook her head. "Slytherin gave me a love potion," she replied, utterly expressionless. "Slytherin?" Ginny repeated, and glanced questioningly at Draco, who looked rooted to the spot. "She means Salazar Slytherin," Charlie explained, looking just as shocked. "He's back from the dead." "I guess I missed that part of the conversation," Ginny said in an undertone, unable to suppress the shudder that passed through her as she remembered the statue of Slytherin from the Chamber of Secrets. His cruel, horrible face. She shook herself and turned back again to Hermione. "What do you mean he gave you a love potion?" she demanded. "Just what I said," Hermione continued, placidly. "Wormtail made me drink it. It burned. It's an ancient spell that makes you fall in love with the first person you see after you drink it. He meant for me to fall in love with him, only the first person I saw was Draco." Ginny turned back to look at Draco, whose eyes were riveted to Hermione. "A love potion," he repeated, the pieces of their earlier encounter beginning to click into place. She nodded. "Yes." "So now you love me because of a potion?" "Yes," she said again. "Oh," he said blankly, and then, "How long is this meant to last for, Hermione?" "I think," she said, "that it's meant to be permanent." "Oh," he said again, still looking stunned. Seeing Draco's face, Ginny turned to her brother, who was looking both concerned and thoughtful. "An ancient love potion," was all he said at first. Then he looked squarely at his sister. "Looks like you made the right call, Ginny." Ginny's smile was grim. She had been right, but it wasn't something to be happy about. "I always thought love potions were a bit of a joke," Charlie went on. "But ancient ones? I know they're real, and very, very illegal." Draco was shaking his head in disbelief. "It makes no sense. Why would Slytherin put a love spell on Hermione?" "Never mind that," Ginny said desperately. "Is there a way of taking it off? Is there a reversal spell?" It was Charlie who answered. "I'm sure there must be one," he said, although he sounded far from sure. "Every spell has a reversal," said Ginny a little shrilly. No, said Charlie. Not every spell. They stared at him. But most do, he added quickly. Silence filled the room at that, and it was into the silence that Ron returned. He was dragging Harry along beside him, and in his other hand was a knot of rags that turned out to be a completely knocked-out demon. "Charlie," he began, then broke off as he surveyed the room. Ron stared at all of them with wide eyes. "What's going on?" "I could ask you the same thing," Charlie said, as his eyes roamed over his brother, who was splattered with dirt and mud. "Well, Harry is passed out from throwing the world's biggest tantrum," Ron began. "And the demon? No idea. It came out of nowhere and attacked both of us in the woods. And you?" "Love potion," said Ginny shortly, and Ron paled in disbelief. Then he glared across the room at Draco. "Malfoy!" he began sharply, but a small groan from Harry stopped him. "Ron," said Charlie with effort, "don't just stand in the doorway. Bring Harry into the next room and we'll discuss your demon in there. You two," he continued, looking at both Ginny and Draco. "Keep Hermione talking, if you can. We need to get as much information out of her before the motion wears off." Ron looked like he wanted to protest, but another groan from Harry had him limping across the room, where Charlie took Harry's other arm and led him away. Ginny watched them go, then glanced at Draco. His face was expressionless, although if she had known him as well as Hermione, she would have seen by the look in his eyes that he was spoiling for a fight. "Right," said Ginny, raised her chin, and returned to questioning Hermione. About 15 minutes later, when they had wrung every ounce of information they could out of her about Slytherin, his source, and his plan, Hermione could feel a strange pain settle in behind her ribcage, an exhaustion that began to creep up on her like a slow and persistent fog, and was pulling her down with lead fingers. By the end of the interrogation, Hermione's voice was shaking with fatigue and drowsiness. Ginny and Draco felt just as worn out, and had taken up 2 chairs on either side of Hermione when Charlie and Ron returned. "Did we get what we needed?" the former asked into the dull silence. "Yes," replied Ginny in a hoarse whisper. "Good," he said. "And now that we have Harry back and that demon is safely locked up, here's what we're going to do. In addition to sending Sirius another owl, I'm also going to be writing a letter to Severus Snape, detailing everything that's happened here. And Ginny, I want you to help me." "Why Snape?" Ron asked suddenly. "Isn't it obvious, Weasley?" returned Draco, with an air of impatience. "No one in the world knows more about potions than he does. My dad said that the Dark Lord himself used to call on him for assistance, back when he was a Death Eater." Ron opened his mouth to retort, but Charlie cut across him. "Exactly," he said. "If the potion is reversible, Severus will know about it. In the meantime, I'll be hitting up our meta-wizard again to see if they have any sleeping draught on hand." "Why?" asked Draco, looking suddenly suspicious. "Because," Charlie continued, "we're going to have to use it on Hermione." At this, Draco stood up very slowly. "I don't think I like how many potions you're trying to pour down her throat, Weasley," he said, grey eyes flashing. "Draco!" Charlie countered, a little more sharply than he meant to. "It's just a sleeping draught. It won't hurt her. And if you want her to get back to Malfoy Manor without her fawning all over you the whole way, I suggest you take my advice. Imagine how Harry will feel when he wakes up and has to live through the experience of her mooning over you again. Even when we tell him it's just a potion, he won't be too thrilled. Trust me on this." "I'll bet he wouldn't mind how Harry feels in the slightest," said Ron with heavy implication. "Shut your mouth, Weasley," replied Draco in a softly dangerous voice.
unless you want to get hexed. Shut up, both of you! Ginny roared, losing her patience completely. This honestly has to stop. She would have said more, but a small noise from Hermione made them all look at her. I'm so tired, she said wearily, before her head slumped forward, and Ginny ran to catch her before she toppled over in her chair. When she looked up a second later, Draco was gone, and all she saw of Ron was the streak of his red hair as he hurried after her. Bugger, she said with feeling. I second that, replied Charlie. His eyes, as he came over to help Ginny, looked just as worn out as the rest of them. Malfoy, said Ron, as he trailed him, determined to have it out with the blonde boy once and for all. Hold up. Draco kept walking. Why are you pretending that I'm not here? Snapped Ron. Wishful thinking, Draco suggested. If you think that the conversation we started earlier is over, you have another thing coming. Oh, goody, said Draco sarcastically. Are you going to say something useful this time, or are you just going to glare at me and be cryptic? No, said Ron irritably. I just wanted to tell you, first, that you're a huge bastard. Glad you got that out of your system, Weasley, said Draco, who was still determinedly walking away. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to be alone with my thoughts, several of which involve killing you in the next moment if you don't leave me alone. Real smug, aren't you? Said Ron pointedly. Enjoy Hermione being in love with you while you can, because once Snape finds a counter potion, I bet the sight of you will just mortify her. Draco stopped walking and whirled around, his eyes so dark that they could have been black holes. Tell me, he began waspishly, when are you going to admit that you're jealous? Ron went white. Jealous? You're the one who's in love with Hermione. I bet it just killed you that she chose Harry, didn't it? And now, because of your selfishness, she's got a love potion. You're the one who is demonstrably selfish, said Draco, his voice alive with menace. He was looking at Ron with an expression that Ron hadn't seen on Draco's face for a while now. Has it occurred to you that none of us can be bothered with you? You think it's killing me to see Harry and Hermione together? I think it's killing you. You've never mattered. Your whole life you've never mattered. The only thing that has ever mattered about you is Harry. If anyone at school knows your name, it's because of Harry. If you've ever won a point for your house, it's because of Harry. The only thing that's ever been special about you, Weasley, is your friends. And now they've got each other, and they don't need you anymore, or want you around. Shut up! Yelled Ron, clenching his hands into fists. Shut up, Malfoy, or I swear I'll rip your throat out. One of these days, they're all going to realize what you're really like. Harry, Hermione, even Sirius. And I'm going to be there to watch. Before Draco could respond, there was a rustle behind them, and Ron turned to see one of Charlie's compatriots pop his head out of his tent. He didn't look very happy. If you two are going to yell at each other, could you at least do it at a more favorable hour? Some of us have work in the morning. Oh, said Ron, his ears turning slightly pink. Sorry. Don't be sorry, said the wizard. Just shut up. Ron muttered another apology, then turned to face Draco once more. But the other boy had gone. Ron could just see him walking away, vanishing quickly from sight as the back of his clothing blended into the darkness of the gathering shadows. He sighed and crossed his arms over his chest, watching him go, hatred still rolling within his chest like an unchained beast, still angry and unsatisfied. Ginny walked into the room Harry was to share with Ron and looked around wearily. Inside was a cozy little space with a desk in one corner with a cracked but clean round mirror hanging over it,
and 2 small beds on which Harry was now lying. Moving slowly, every bone in her body aching with tiredness, she walked over to the bed and sat down. She had just spent the last several minutes helping Charlie compose his letter to Snape, but had asked if she could look in on Harry before finally going to sleep. Charlie had agreed, saying that he could finish the letter on his own, which, by that point, was already 3 sheets of parchment long. Now that she was here, she looked at Harry as if really seeing him for the first time that day. He looked a little older, less like himself, and more like a photograph of himself. He was browner, too, probably from the sun, which had given him a smattering of freckles across the bridge of his nose. As if sensing her presence, he slowly opened his eyes and looked at her. "Ginny?" "Yes," she said, without really thinking. "How are you feeling?" There was a pause. "My girlfriend broke up with me today, so I'm pretty miserable." "I can imagine," she said, then added, "Charlie thought we should tell you in the morning, but I wanted to let you know now in case you woke up and were feeling uncertain. Hermione doesn't love Draco. Slytherin made her drink a potion that accidentally made her fall in love with the first person she saw. That that happened to be Draco at the time was unfortunate. So, you were right," he said after a moment's pause. "I was," she replied glumly. In response, Harry reached a hand into his jacket pocket and drew out a folded piece of parchment, which he stared at. It was creased and shiny from being read and reread. Ginny recognized it as the letter that Hermione had written while under the Imperious Curse, telling Harry that she was leaving him for Victor. The fact that Hermione was really in love with another boy now only made her feel more sad for Harry. "When I thought this was real, it was Draco who snapped me out of it," said Harry distantly. He was utterly positive that she was acting strange. How could he not have seen that it was a love potion right off? Ginny thought she knew the answer to that question, but didn't want to voice anything that might sound like she was blaming Harry or Draco for any of this, so she stayed silent. Harry took a deep breath, then lowered the letter. "You know, I've learned enough about myself, Ginny, to know what really scares me. And that's just one thing. The idea of losing my family. Again. Ron and Sirius and Hermione. She's everything to me." He looked at her, and Ginny was startled to see unshed tears brimming at the corner of his eyes. "I'm never going to not trust her again," he said. "Look at the mess it got us into. And now she's in even more danger than I could have ever imagined." Ginny wanted to say something profound and soothing, but didn't get the chance to, as they both heard the sound of feet in the hall and turned their heads to see Ron enter. He was looking peevish, but quickly recovered when he saw that Harry was awake. "All right, Harry?" "Yeah," said Harry with dignity, scrubbing a hand across his eyes so the other boy wouldn't see how troubled he actually was. "We were just talking." Ron looked at his sister. "I think you should try and get some sleep, Ginny. Charlie says we've got to go to Malfoy Manor tomorrow." He looked annoyed at the prospect. "Malfoy Manor?" Harry asked, surprised. "Good night then, boys," said Ginny, and stood up. She felt, rather than saw, Harry look at her with a quizzical expression on her face, but she knew that Ron wanted to be the one to fill him in, so she did the only sensible thing she could, and left. "Sleep well," she thought absently, before wandering down the hall to her own room. He was walking swiftly through the gardens of the tower in the forest, only now it was whole, and the gardens were alive with flowers. Mounting the steps, he went through the open double doors of the tower into an anteroom hung with tapestries and glowing with candlelight. Hermione was waiting for him there, although she looked very different. Her hair was plaited on top of her head, and she wore a green silk dress tasseled with gold. She stood up on her tiptoes and kissed him, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as though she kissed him every day. "Hello, love," he heard himself say, although it wasn't what he had planned to say. He had wanted to ask her why she was all dressed up. "Did you miss me?" "I always miss you when you're gone," she said, pulling back a little and making a face. "But look, you're all bloody." "Yes," he heard himself say. "It just won't wash out." She reached up and touched his face, and as she did so, he saw that there was a scar on the inside of her wrist. He tried to lean closer to see it, but his dream self wasn't cooperating. "Things are better now, aren't they?" he heard himself say. "You mean since you killed him?" asked Hermione, looking cheerful. "Oh, yes, things are much better now." He jerked away from her, his non-dream self taking over for an instant. "What? Who did I kill?" he demanded. Her eyes widened in surprise, and then she spun away from him, vanishing along with the richly decorated staircase, the walls, and the rest of the dream. When he opened his eyes, he was staring at the black sky carpeted with stars. He was lying on the ground at the base of a rock that he'd been sitting on earlier after storming away from Ron. One of his arms was under his head, the other stretched out next to him, clutching the hilt of Slytherin's sword. He sat up slowly, having no memory of falling asleep there, but aware that he was drenched in cold sweat, and looked down at the sword. "I thought we were done with all this nightmare business," he said to it. "Am I ever going to get another peaceful night's sleep as long as I have you?" The green jewels in the hilt glittered up at him like winking eyes. "Who did I kill?" he asked it, but he knew. Remus Lupin had never before been to Malfoy Manor, but if he had, he would have been astonished upon arriving to see how much it had changed. The giant spiders were gone, as was the vicious topiary, the spiky portcullises, the magical landmines, and the jigsaw hexes. The Venus flytraps and black hedgerows had been replaced with neat, herbaceous borders that would one day sprout daisies, if Narcissa had her way. The bottomless pit was still there, although auras from the Ministry of Magic had surrounded it with blinking signs that read, "Danger! Approach and risk hurtling through empty space for all eternity." When Lupin entered the drawing room, he found Sirius waiting for him there, wearing black silk pajamas and looking slightly grim. "Are Harry and Draco still missing?" Lupin asked worriedly. "No, they're all right," said Sirius, then explained about the owl he had sent to Ron Weasley and how Charlie Weasley had been the one to write back. "They were with him at that dragon camp he runs, and he'll be sending them home in the morning," he continued, taking Lupin's case from him and indicating that his friend should follow him upstairs. "They went to look for Hermione, didn't they?" Lupin said, feeling both relieved and disquieted. "Yes, and she's with them now, but—" And Sirius trailed off as they turned a corner. "What?" asked Lupin. In answer, Sirius pulled a slightly crushed piece of parchment from the pocket of his trousers and handed it to Lupin, who took it curiously. As he scanned the letter, his step faltered. "A love potion," he said hollowly. Sirius nodded. Feeling slightly sickened, Lupin looked down at the letter again. Was that really Salazar Slytherin she was kidnapped by, or someone who was just claiming to be Slytherin? "If Wormtail is working with him," said Sirius darkly, "I would be willing to bet this whole manor he was legit."
You know that little weasel always flees to the shadow of the most powerful wizard." Lupin made a noise, something that sounded like begrudging agreement. If that's the case, that makes this very Baroque mythology, involving Slytherin, Rowena Ravenclaw, Godric Gryffindor, and several demons, even more in line with that prophecy. The Centaur said this would happen. "Is that the reason you wanted to keep that sword away from Draco?" Sirius asked. "Well," Lupin hedged, "yes. When I told you about that prophecy, that Slytherin will rise again, and with the help of his descendant will wreak havoc and terror on the wizarding world, I was a little concerned that Draco might have been the focal point of that prophecy." "You can't mean to tell me you think Draco is going to go around wreaking havoc and terror on the wizarding world?" said Sirius doubtfully. "He's only 16. "I didn't say that," said Lupin, "but things are beginning to fall into place." Sirius looked at him. "Please tell me that place is somewhere near this place, because I'm not following you." They had reached the library now, and Lupin couldn't help but whistle as they walked into the room beyond the door. It was an enormous, hexagonal room with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness and dust motes far above. Huge bookshelves lined the walls, reaching so high above their heads that the tallest shelves could only be reached by climbing the carved mahogany ladders that were ranged around the room at intervals and kept upright by magic. Lupin could tell just by looking at the spines of the books that many of them were incredibly ancient and rare. He stared at them a moment, then he turned back to Sirius. "Have you ever seen a picture of the Founding Four?" "Well, I've seen portraits, statues and the like, but never a portrait of them when they were young." Sirius stared at him. "What are you getting at?" "Come here," said Lupin, and beckoned him over. Sirius followed Lupin as he crossed to the nearest desk, took his case from his friend, opened it, and took out the book the Centaur had given him, which he began flipping through with casual speed. As he reached the last page, he turned it around to show Sirius. It was an illustration of a group portrait of 4 people. Sirius stared. Whoever the unknown artist of the portrait had been, they had captured not just the appearance, but the spirit of all 4. Salazar stood with his chin raised, looking arrogant. Rowena looked thoughtful, Helga ebullient, and Godric faced the observer with a direct and challenging gaze. He knew why Lupin had showed him this. There was, in all their faces, a definite resemblance to 4 teens that he knew. It wasn't physically obvious, but it was there in the eyes and the way they held themselves. "What does it mean?" asked Sirius. "I've absolutely no idea," said Lupin, snapping the book shut. "Nothing good, I imagine." There was a pause, then Sirius asked, "Tell me the truth. Do you think the love potion is reversible?" "I don't know," replied Lupin, who began taking down a number of books from the shelves and tossing them onto the desk. "But what I do know is that love potions are not exactly benign magic. There's a reason they're illegal." "Because they're really, really annoying?" asked Sirius, somewhat craggily. "Any magic that contradicts one's essential nature is by definition dark magic," said Lupin. "Love potions are simply another variation of what goes into the Imperious Curse, an enchantment that subsumes the will of the subject." Sirius shook his head. "Hermione is a strong-willed girl." "That doesn't matter," said Lupin, flipping morosely through Lucius's copy of Most Potent Potions. "An ancient love potion could be that potion in its most primal, An ancient love potion could be that potion at its most primal, irreversible by nature, but I really couldn't say for sure." Sirius rubbed the back of his hand across his eyes. "I suppose this is the reason Charlie said he was going to write Snape." "Did he say that?" asked Lupin. "I must not have gotten to that bit of the letter."
Better him than me, said Sirius gloomily. Why do you say that? Mooney, if I were to write and ask him for a favor, I don't think he would exactly hop right to it. Snape hates me. Probably on account of that one time you tormented him mercilessly for 7 years straight when we were at school, said Lupin dryly. Yes, he's touchy that way, agreed Sirius. Lupin glanced over at his friend. I suppose now is as good a time as any to begin work on translating that book. Agreed, said Sirius, and I will be writing Charlie back to tell him to send that demon here. In the morning, Harry, Ron, and Ginny got up and prepared to leave. They were a glum and silent group. Ron looked sulky, Harry anxious, and Ginny didn't seem to have slept at all. It had been decided that it would be safer for Hermione if she was allowed to reside in Charlie's care until such a time as he could portkey her to the manor. Harry hadn't liked the idea, but didn't seem to have much say in the matter. The demon, however, was another mystery entirely, and Charlie was currently waiting on an owl from Sirius to tell them how to proceed on that front. During all this, Harry had been glancing around distractedly. Where's Malfoy? Doesn't he know that we're supposed to leave now? I don't know, said Ron sourly. I vote we leave him here and he can catch up later. We can't find the manor without him, said Harry crossly. It's unplottable. Ginny sighed and dropped her broomstick. Which way did you say you saw him go last night, Ron? Her brother grimaced, but pointed at a vague direction off into the woods. I'll go get him, she said. Be right back, and walked in the direction of Ron's gesturing hand. She eventually emerged into the clearing, the sword being the first thing she saw, with its green jewels glittering in the morning light. It was stuck blade first into an oak tree. Then she looked down and saw Draco, curled up on the ground, his head on his arms, apparently asleep. He had taken off his jacket and used it as a pillow. His hair looked very white against the black material. Ginny leaned down and gently shook him. Hey, she said, Malfoy, wake up. We're all waiting for you. Slowly he opened his eyes and blinked at her before sitting up and leaning back on his hands. Where are we going? He asked, still blinking tiredly. To Malfoy Manor, she said simply, then added, Did you sleep out here all night? Draco didn't say anything, just stood up and brushed the dirt off his clothes before reaching over to pull the sword from the tree. Ginny looked at him sideways. You look tired. Yeah, he said. I am tired. Are you still having nightmares? She asked, as they began to leave the clearing. When he spoke again, it was in a flat tone, and she knew immediately that he was lying. Just your run-of-the-mill bad dreams, academic failure, falling off my broomstick, suddenly realizing I'm wearing tweed out of season. Ginny laughed, despite herself. A smile quirked at the corner of his mouth. You have a nice laugh, he said. Suddenly, Ginny felt very sober. Before we rejoin the others, I just want to say that Ron was being a right git last night, she said. And also, Harry knows you didn't do anything wrong. Don't let Ron talk you into feeling guilty. I don't feel guilty, said Draco in a rather muffled voice. I have 6 older brothers, said Ginny with asperity. I know what boys look like when they are feeling guilty. They crawl away and curl themselves up into little miserable balls and insist that they want to be left alone, which is what you're doing. I didn't tell you to leave me alone. I just don't feel like whinging all over you either. You know, said Ginny, feeling a strange fluttering in the pit of her stomach, I think now would be a good time for one of your father's pithy sayings. Got anything useful that would be helpful right now? For some reason, the only one of my father's sayings that seems to be sticking in my head right now is when he told me, there's always a light at the end of the tunnel. Of
course, it's usually an oncoming express train. That's not very encouraging, said Ginny dubiously. No, Draco agreed. No, it really isn't. Lupin took his glasses off and rubbed the back of his hand across his eyes. He felt half blind with exhaustion, but at the same time utterly unable to sleep. Sitting behind the desk in what had once been Lucius Malfoy's library, he turned page after page of books, engaged in what seemed more and more like a fruitless search for some way of translating the Centaur's book. Brilliant sunlight poured in through the windows, throwing moving blocks of color over his hands as he looked down at his latest read, Guides to Dead Languages. It lay strewn across the desk, but had not yielded up any kind of Rosetta Stone that might allow him to make sense of the meaningless squiggles. There was a cramp in his shoulder, and it finally prompted him to move. He stood up and stretched his arms out, and as he did, the sound of the library door swinging open caused him to turn. It was Sirius, looking slightly haggard, but very nice in a white shirt and black trousers. "Moony, were you in here all night?" he said without preamble. "I know you're a night creature, but you really should have gotten some sleep." Ignoring the question, Lupin cleared his throat, trying to force his voice to function. "Are the kids here yet?" he asked. "Not yet," said Sirius, "and to be honest, I'm not certain how I should greet them." "What do you mean?" Lupin asked. "Well," began Sirius a little gloomily, "what can I tell them? When I was your age, I never would have dreamed of sneaking away from school in the middle of the night and not telling anyone where I was going. And oh, by the way, there's an excellent view right into the Ravenclaw girls' shower." "Ah," said Lupin. "First off, I think it was the Hufflepuff girls. Not that I know what you're talking about, because I don't. But more to the point, are you worried about having to be a disciplinarian in this moment?" "Yes," said Sirius, even more gloomily. "I haven't the faintest idea of what to say to them, and Narcissa won't be any help. She feels so guilty about Lucius and everything that happened that she wouldn't discipline her own son if he burned the house down. Perhaps I should have a birthday party for Harry." "What?" said Lupin, startled by this sudden change in subject. "He's going to be 17, Sirius continued, clearly avoiding any thoughts of discipline and parental duty. "That's quite an important age. I'm not certain how throwing him a birthday party is how one disciplines, but then again, I'm not a parent, so I don't know how to answer that question," said Lupin. "Perhaps not, but it might take his mind off things, at least until we sort out this debacle of the love potion. Incidentally, Moony, can you recall who any of his friends are at Hogwarts?" Lupin snorted. "Don't try to get me involved in party planning, Sirius. The last party I was at was James's bachelor party, and that was 20 years ago. And yet I remember it like it was yesterday," said Sirius, the corner of his mouth twitching ever so slightly. Lupin raised an eyebrow. "I'd be shocked if you remembered any of it. In my recollection, you got thoroughly pissed, stood on your head in the front garden, and sang 18 verses of a song entitled, 'I may be a tiny chimney sweep, but I've got an enormous broom.' Then we had to carry you home." "That song only has 15 verses, said Sirius with dignity. "Then you made up the last 3. Did they rhyme?" "Sirius, you brought it up," said Sirius, and made a face. "See, that's what I'm talking about. How am I supposed to be any sort of moral example to Harry? I never had a moral example when I was his age, except maybe James. And what can I say about that? Be like your father?" "He could do a lot worse," said Lupin. "I know," said Sirius and sighed. "But he's never known his father, so will it really mean anything to him? And what about Draco? I'm not his real father, after all." "And
In answer, Lupin cast a glance out the window, as the shadows of several people caught in the glass of it. I guess you're going to get a chance to find out. As soon as Sirius was outside, all his attempts to be stern and disciplinary were summarily ruined by the fact that when they all walked into the anteroom at Malfoy Manor, holding their broomsticks and looking wary, he couldn't help but to laugh. "Draco!" he exclaimed. "What are you wearing?" Draco looked down blankly, then back up again. "Charlie's clothes," he said. "Ha!" said Sirius shortly, or something very like it. "I think he looks sweet," said Narcissa, who had been standing beside Sirius on the stairs with her arms folded. Unable to suppress a smile, she uncrossed them, walked down the stairs, threw her arms around Draco, and kissed him on the forehead. He exclaimed, looking only marginally less horrified than he had when confronted with Salazar Slytherin. "Those trousers can't be comfortable," she said. They're fine," he said through gritted teeth. Meanwhile, Harry was looking at Sirius with tired eyes. Sirius caught his glance, came down the stairs, and stood looking at Harry for a moment, noting with a pang that Harry was now nearly as tall as he was. "Hello, Sirius," said Harry, looking nervous. Sirius stood looking at his godson. Then he said, "Welcome home, Harry." Later, in the library, they all had a chance to tell their side of the story until the full scope of what had happened had been revealed. At some point, Narcissa excused herself to talk to the returning Aurors, who had come to pick up the last of Lucius's dark arts collection. It was mid-morning now, and the stained glass windows threw dizzying patches of colored light over everyone as the four teenagers concluded their stories. Lupin stood with his hands clenched on the side of the desk, while Sirius listened with his eyes narrowed and his fingers laced together under his chin. When they had all finished, Sirius lowered his hands to the desk and shook his head. "Well," he began, trying for casual, "you've all been through quite a bit, and you've all been very brave, if somewhat impetuous, but I think you should also know that this situation reaches far beyond you." Sirius glanced over at Lupin, and then back at Harry and the rest. "Professor Dumbledore and Cornelius Fudge are coming here to talk to you. This is a serious situation, and because of that, I was forced to owl your parents this morning, Ron." "Sirius?" said Ron, looking betrayed. "How could you?" Despite himself, Harry felt a small smile creep across his mouth. Ron wasn't used to this new, more parental Sirius. He was used to a Sirius on the run from authorities, a Sirius who lived in a cave, ate rats, and never, ever owled anyone's parents. "Well, I haven't heard back yet," said Sirius. "Maybe they all got lost," said Ron hopefully. "Maybe you couldn't find them on holiday." "Ron, Outpost doesn't go missing," said Ginny irritably. "But in the meantime, you can dream," pointed out Sirius. "And we might as well tell you, Harry," said Lupin, crossing his arms, "that you've been expelled from Majid School." Harry made a sort of choking noise. "Expelled?" "Well," Lupin pointed out gently, "you did break about 30 school rules, run away while classes were in session, and destroyed school property." "Expelled?" Harry repeated, looking horrified. Then he glanced up at Lupin and asked, "Is Malfoy expelled too?" Yes," said Lupin, blinking in surprise. "Good," said Harry, with immense satisfaction. "Hey!" said Draco, incensed. "Really, Harry? Is that all you care about?" said Sirius, looking amused, despite himself. "Well, no, but it's good to know," said Harry. "In the meantime," pressed Draco, shooting Harry a look, "what are we going to do about that love spell on Hermione?" "Until Snape gets back to Charlie, we're just going to have to research as much as we can on how to potentially break that charm. Here, Sirius said.
Sirius? Said Ron, as if something else had just occurred to him. What do you and Charlie plan to do with the demon?
Charlie currently has it in a dungeon, in stasis, and surrounded by wards, said Sirius, and glanced at Lupin. I told him that when he has the time, he should bring it here to the manor, as this place has some of the best dungeons in all Britain. We'll keep it here until Dumbledore lets us know how to proceed.
What do you think it wanted? Asked Ron.
It was Harry who answered.
That bloody sword of Draco's. I'm fairly sure that's what it wanted.
Draco shot him an irritated look. How do you know?
Harry sighed and proceeded to tell the whole room about the initial visitation from the first demon back at school. When he had finished, Lupin and Sirius exchanged dark looks. I told you it was a possessed object, Draco, said Lupin unhappily. Why did you have to remove it from the one place these demons couldn't get at it?
Ron snorted. Telling Malfoy that something is evil is like telling Crabbe or Goyle that something's made out of toffee. It brings out this whole primal must-have-that side of him. You should have seen him when Harry was telling him he shouldn't bring it, he added dramatically. It was scary.
You haven't begun to see scary yet, Weasley,
Draco said with a nasty smile, but Lupin was looking at Harry.
Is what Ron's saying true, Harry?
Harry looked as if he wanted to squirm, and he shot a quick glance over at Draco, who was looking defiant.
There was a certain scare factor,
he admitted, but it sounded half-hearted. So what? Draco scoffed. Demons are strange creatures. They are completely devoted to sowing discord. They are far more given to driving rigid bargains than driving bargains, eh? Said Ron, raising an eyebrow. Draco glared over at him. What? Ron tapped his fingers on the desk.
Well, if anyone seems likely to be the type to go around driving bargains with the forces of darkness.
Driving bargains in exchange for what? Snapped Draco.
Ron looked directly into the eyes of the other boy as he said, Hermione, he said. She's in love with you now, isn't she? Isn't that what you've always wanted? Stop it, Ron, said Ginny with finality.
No, it's all right, Ginny, said Draco smoothly, although he looked mad enough to spit fire. Induced love isn't my thing, Weasley, and since we're on the subject of possessed objects, let's start with you. You all say my sword is a danger, but the only thing I see in this room in which a prolonged contact could warp a person's mind and personality is Weasley here. At least I don't put other people's lives in danger, yelled Ron.
Draco didn't move, didn't change expression, but his silver eyes spat angry sparks. I've got nothing to say to you, Weasley, he snarled, except that if you think I'd sell my soul for a cheap love spell, you have even less imagination than I gave you credit for.
It takes imagination to give you credit for having a soul in the first place, Malfoy, said Ron. For a brief moment, Draco almost looked as if he were going to laugh.
You'd be surprised, he said.
Draco, said Sirius, speaking at last, as he leaned forward on the desk. You have to tell us what's been happening. We need to know if... You're not my father, said Draco icily, glaring at Sirius. I don't have to tell you anything. What is it you all think you need to know? That I'm not dangerous? Well, I can't promise you that, especially if...
Nobody thinks you sold your soul,
interrupted Lupin, coming around the desk and approaching Draco.
We're afraid for you,
not... Shut up, werewolf, said Draco evenly, and don't come near me.
Malfoy, said Harry finally, if there's really nothing wrong with you, then give us the sword.
He held out a hand.
Give it to me.
Draco took a step back. Fuck you, Potter, he said, and turned around as if he were going to bolt out of the room. But Lupin, who could move very, very quickly when necessary, blocked his way.
"You're not going anywhere," he said, and reached out to take hold of Draco's arm. Draco twisted sideways and nearly collided with the other man as he did so. Lupin gave a sudden yell of pain, fell backwards, and landed on the floor. Draco backed away from him, white-faced, holding his arm with an expression that could have been astonishment, or horror, or guilt. "Malfoy," said Harry, but Draco turned and bolted out of the room, not even bothering to slam the door behind him. Sirius dropped to his knees on the floor next to Lupin and looked wildly up at the other three. "Go after him," he yelled. They didn't need to be told twice. Feverishly, the three of them bolted out of the library and into the corridor, which was empty. Harry looked up and down the hall briefly. "Split up. Go, both of you," he said, and bolted off to the right. Ginny and Ron dashed to the left, but parted ways at the end of the corridor, Ron racing down the stairs while Ginny turned to the right. Meanwhile, back in the library, Lupin was irritably pushing Sirius's hands away as he struggled to sit up. "Get off, Sirius, I'm fine," he said crossly, and leaned back against the bookshelf, cradling his right arm against his chest. "I'm fine," he repeated with emphasis. "What happened?" Sirius demanded. "What did he do to you?" Lupin's eyes widened. "Draco? He didn't do anything to me." "Well, it looked like he did. You grabbed him and then you yelled and collapsed." "No, he didn't even touch me," said Lupin, and pointed at an object lying on the ground a few feet away that gave off a dull silvery glint. "It was that." Sirius looked askance. "What is it? Is it dangerous?" "Not to you. Go on, pick it up." Looking dubious, Sirius retrieved the glinting object and held it up to the light, glancing at the odd shape of the sideways X. "I can't touch it," Lupin said as Sirius returned to his side, object in hand. "Why not?" "It's a lycanth," said Lupin. "Old magic. Protection against werewolves." "Strange shape," said Sirius, turning it over in his hands. "Not really," said Lupin, and smiled a funny half-smile. "Say you're walking through the forest at night, alone, no help in sight, and you don't have a wand. Then a wolf jumps out of the darkness, straight at your throat. What do you do?" Without thinking, Sirius threw up his arms, one across his throat, the other crossed over it, protecting his face, making a sideways X. "Right," said Lupin. Sirius blinked and lowered his arms. "The question is," mused Lupin, "why would Draco have something like that? They were common hundreds of years ago, when werewolves were a problem, but now..." He broke off as the library door flew open. Sirius leapt to his feet and spun around, obviously hoping that the kids had managed to retrieve Draco, but it was Narcissa, looking very pale, and holding a letter in her hand, an official-looking piece of parchment bordered with black. "Sirius," she said uncertainly, "it's Dumbledore. He and Fudge were on their way here when they were attacked. Sirius, I'm so sorry." Meanwhile, Draco, who had dashed down a little-used staircase he was fairly sure the others didn't know about, emerged in the garden and began racing towards the gate where he had stashed his broomstick. He was halfway there when he heard footsteps on the path behind him. Harry, he thought, and was sure of it. "It's like you said, Potter," he said without turning around, but instead slowed to a walk. "I'm stalking off. It doesn't work if you come with me." There was a short silence, and the footsteps behind him slowed. Then he heard a voice say, "Malfoy, it's me." He whirled around, saw Ginny standing there, and a cold, miserable anguish lanced through him like a sharp steel point. "You shouldn't have come after me," he said harshly. "Where are you going?" she demanded. "I was pretty much concentrating on away from you lot, and figuring I'd fill in the rest of it later. You can't go, she said, putting her hands on her hips and glaring at him. This is your house. It's where you belong. Where else are you going to find people who can help you? Maybe I don't want help, he said, knowing he sounded as if he were about 7, but unable to help it. Maybe that just proves that you need it, she said. Is this why you came boating after me? Some sort of misguided idea about friendship? I'm not the only one who came running after you, she snapped. Everyone's worried. So where are they? Looking for you, she shouted. But they don't know where you went, idiot. I just happened to get lucky. Well, bully for you, he almost shouted. You know what I can't stand in any of this? It's that I don't seem to get any choices. I don't get a choice about my family, or my life, or my destiny. I don't even get a choice about being in love with Hermione. It's ironic, isn't it? The version of her that I love loves Harry. I mean, I know I'm not a nice person, but what the fuck did I do in my past life to deserve this? I mean, this whole thing is because of Salazar Slytherin. Doubt it all you like. He will make you regret it. He broke off, and Ginny raised an eyebrow. What on earth are you talking about? He threw his hands up in exasperation. Forget it. I'm leaving anyway. I've got an errand to do. She stared at him. You can't just go, she protested. Draco shrugged. So cover for me. What? Cover for me. I'll be back later. Maybe tonight. Where am I supposed to tell them you've gone, if they ask? You're quick-witted. I know you'll think of something, said Draco, as a sudden sound of running feet on gravel materialized in the distance. He started to back up towards the wall, feeling behind him for his broomstick. The sound of more running feet was clearly audible now. Harry and Weasley, he thought dismally, as his hand closed around his firebolt. He mounted it and looked back at Ginny. When Hermione wakes up, tell her, Draco began, and felt his throat close up suddenly. Ginny was looking at him, her expression unreadable in the half-light. Oh, forget it, he finished wearily, and kicked off, soared upward, and vanished into the night sky. And that was all for this chapter, guys. The Undiscovered Country is from, I should say, Hamlet. I suppose I did, if that is, you mean defeated in the sense of having met, is from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Probably on account of that one time you beat him up for 7 years straight when we were in school is from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I May Be a Tiny Chimney Sweep is from Blackadder. A Lycanthia was made by Tanith Lee. I'm storming away, or stalking away, it doesn't work if you come with me, is from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. As always, if you are enjoying this content, be sure to like, comment, subscribe to the channel. And if you are feeling frisky, go ahead and check out my Patreon. It is linked in my description box in my About page. Patreon. That's got, my personal writings on it and my spicy art content for higher tiers for those that are interested. So if you could check that out, that would be amazing. I much appreciate it. And I will see you all in the next one. Good night.